I'm looking at page 333 in the book. About the time, but just beginning short before Charlemagne passed off the scene, three groups of people began hitting Europe. The Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims, and it looked like Europe was going to be hammered from all sides. The Vikings lived in what we today call Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And they began to sweep down, and they went all over much of Europe. They conquered part of France and called it Normandy. They eventually conquered England. King Canute the Great is one of England's kings. He was from Denmark. They went around Spain and set up a colony of Normandy, even down here in Italy. So they went all over the place, and they spread terror everywhere they went. But I want to elaborate a little bit. Somehow your book does not mention this. This is, oh, I'm talking over top of you. We have to get some kind of order. Okay. The Vikings came to North America. We now know that to be a fact. We have found some of their artifacts. They went to Iceland first. From there, the ship blew off course, went to Greenland. And from Greenland, they went to Nova Scotia. We have found a colony in Nova Scotia. We have found a colony in Greenland. And there are rumors that Viking artifacts have been found as far away as Minnesota. In other words, they might have gone across the Great Lakes and all the way to Lake Superior. You've heard that story too. Found all the way to Minnesota. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, in our fights with the Indians, round one goes to the Indians. The Indians eventually drove the Vikings out of North America. But then came something else. A great cooling hit. And the cooling destroyed all the Viking colonies in the New World. And because the Black Death hit Europe with a great cooling, it was 200 years before another Viking ship went to Greenland, and they found the last people who died in their bed, nobody to bury them. And that's sad, because if the Vikings would have made friends with the Eskimos knew how to handle that kind of weather. The Vikings looked on the Eskimos as being demons, or as they called them, Skraelings, and they would not have anything to do with the Eskimos, but the Eskimos could handle that kind of climate. Instead, the Vikings, initially the Vikings farmed in Greenland the way they had farmed in Norway and Sweden. And folk, that can't be done today. What I strongly believe is the Vikings named this area Greenland for the simple reason it was a green land. Not to try to get settlers to falsely advertising it. It actually was a green land at one time. It's known that the certain species of grapes that they described will not grow today any farther north than New Jersey. In those days, it grew in Nova Scotia. They obviously had a warmer climate. I'm going to be saying more about that later. Then the climate cooled. The Viking colony died out. Now, something else. If you think the word Scandinavia sounds like the word scandal, there's a reason for that. The rest of Europe looked on some of the conduct of the Scandinavian people as being scandalous. And Sweden is the most liberal country in Europe as far as its morals. And even though Europe's morals have, to me, gone downhill in recent years, Sweden is known for its liberalism and has been down for the last 1,000 or so years. Anyway, the Vikings spread terror. While the Vikings were spreading their terror, and from Mongolia. Now, I've talked about many a group of people who came in from Mongolia. I mean, the Mongols themselves, the Turks, the Huns, the Magyars, the Bulgars. These were the Magyars. They were one of the last groups to come in. They came in and they began to harass this part of Europe, Transylvania, Romania, this region of Europe here. And then from the west and the east and the south, the Muslims were hitting from Spain. They were threatening also to get in from the east, and they had the island of Sicily. So it looked like for a time that Europe was in trouble, being beset by all these foreign invaders. And chaos reigned in Europe for a while. Now eventually Europe overcame all of them. The Vikings settled down after they conquered a territory in France and called it Normandy and conquered part of Italy and conquered England. They settled down, they became Christian, and they mixed in and mixed with it, became part of the European scene. The Magyars, once they had settled in, they became like the people they conquered. They became Christian, and they settled in and became part of the European scene. And regrettably, I must say, as far as the Muslims go, the fight between them and the Europeans is going on to this day. I mean, that's just a historical fact. We have found at least one Viking ship, which your book shows a picture of on page 333. You notice they're pointed at both ends, which means they could go up a river and then go back down the river without turning around. Also, it's known that they hung the shields on the sides of the ship, which the illustration here does not tend to show, even though the painting shows the shields being held by the Viking troops, Navy men, seamen, whatever you call them. And on the front and the back, they usually had a dragon.
What chapter?
I'm told page 333, chapter 12.
Chapter 12?
Yes. They usually had a dragon head. Some people believe the dragon head was to scare the people they invaded. I mean, if you can imagine a bunch of dragon ships just sailing up the river, and it would create fear in the hearts of people who they were attacking. And by the time you got to your king, and the king could send an army to fight them, they were gone. They managed to strike and leave. But some people also believe the dragons on the front and the back of the ships were to scare sea monsters, of which the Vikings believed quite strongly in. They believed in the sea serpent, and several persons claim to have seen a large sea serpent. This is true down through the ages. You might wonder why don't we spot it today? Maybe the sea serpent either died or he's frightened away by our motorboats. The Vikings, of course, did not have motorboats. But several persons claim to have seen sea serpents. And they believed that Thor, their god of thunder, whom you might have seen in the movies, the god with a big hammer, that on the day of Ragnarok, the day of doom, Thor was destined to slay the sea serpent, but be killed with the sea serpent's poison. Now, about the Vikings, I want to elaborate a bit farther. 4 of our 7 days of the week are named after them. Thor, I've already mentioned, Thursday is named after Thor. Wednesday, today is Wednesday, named after Odin, the chief of all the Norse gods. Odin, Thor. Friday, named after Frigga, their goddess of love and beauty and romance and sex. They're named after Frigga. Now, the first one, though, is Tuesday, Tur, the god of bravery. Tur was the one who, when they asked the famous wolf to consent to be bound, the wolf said, well, if one of you will offer me your right hand, I'll let you bind me. Tur was the one who offered his right hand. And when the famous wolf could not break the bonds, he clamped down and took off Tur's hand. Have any ever read these legends? Any other source? Not very many people are nodding your head, yes. You have. There have been movies now recently that featured Thor and Asgard, the home of the gods of Asgard. Thor, particularly his enemy Loki, his brother Loki, and Odin. There's supposed to be another one that may be made somewhat soon, I guess. But anyway, these were the Norse gods. They made news in fairly recent time because Adolf Hitler tried to return Europe to the worship of them. He was unsuccessful. All right. Now, what I've said all that for was to say this. As a result of all the turmoil in Europe, the feudal system emerged. Essentially, Europeans realized we have to have some kind of order. I mean, it wasn't just foreign invaders. With an absence of a strong king, outlaw bands were just roaming all over the place, including Robin Hood. I mean, if you can believe the story. Now, we don't know if Robin Hood actually existed, but outlaws of his type did exist. Outlaw bands were roaming around all over the place, and what would happen was some man would eventually go to his more powerful neighbor and say, I can't defend myself. Can you please help me? And he'd kneel down, and the Lord would put his hands out like this, and the neighbor then being the kneel position would put his hands together, and they'd kind of clasp hands. And the vassal, and they had a system, the vassal, that's the word vassal means person who's subject. The person who is subjugating himself to the Lord would say, I will fight your battles for you, I will follow you to the ends of the earth if need be. And then the Lord would promise to protect the vassal. And they would enter into these partnerships and agreements. Nobody planned it in advance, but essentially, with weak kings, lords began to take over, and they brought some order to Europe. The ranks, there was a duke, count, viscount, barons. These are the ranks that your book tends to mention. In addition, there are some clergy also, the bishops, archbishops and bishops. To be an archbishop or bishop, you almost had to have been of noble birth. They had hardly ever made anyone of common birth, any of these. Now, there were a few exceptions. One man of common birth eventually got to be Pope. Pope Sylvester V by name. Don't worry about the name, but Pope Sylvester was recognized for his brilliance. And we don't doubt he is brilliant, but he was a man of common birth who became educated, rose up through the ranks all the way to become Pope. But that did not happen very often. All right. These, they organize themselves again into these ranks, and the land that they use. Now, there was very little money in those days, so wealth consists of two, or rather, payment consists of two things: service and land. Service usually meant, I will fight for you. This was what they needed most, because so much of what they had to do was fight. And a lot of the fighting, regretfully, was not just fighting off Vikings or Magyars. A lot of the fighting was fighting among themselves. But nevertheless, there was a lot of fighting that went on. So they would organize themselves, and the land was called a fief. Fief is the term used to describe the land that the Lord would give to the person who was subjecting himself to him. In other words, the Lord would say, I still own the land. The land is mine, but because I have more land than I need, you, sir, so-and-so, you can take this land and work it, and you, sir, thus and such, you take that land and you work that land. And but the land, again, was still owned by the Lord, but he would grant some of his more able servants a plot of land called a fief. Now, if you look on page 334, and again, I see a few of you following along in the book, you may notice that the fief is plowed in long, long strips of land that reminds you somewhat of bacon strips. And the reason for that was they were plowing these in those days with teams of maybe 8, 10, or 12 horses. And it took a lot of effort to turn all those horses. So they would when the team of horses started plowing, they would plow for a long, long ways up and down. Then at the end of the field, they would turn around and plow again. But the idea was to try to keep the horses from turning any more than they had to, which helps to explain some of the long strips. The land that the Lord lived on was called a manor. It was generally an agricultural estate. Now at this time, this area was rural. Which meant it was mostly countryside and farm with a few towns, as opposed to urban that came later. The word urban means big city or filled with cities. Rural means countryside. The European Middle Ages at this point was mostly countryside. And again, there's a limit to how far advanced the countryside society can get. There's no place on earth that has all the materials you need to make things that you want to make. Hence, you have to trade. With trade and manufacturing, you have to have cities. All that was to come later. But start off with the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages were agrarian and rural. Oh yeah. The Lord's domain is spelled D-E-M-E-N-S-C, it looks, but it's pronounced domain. Was the plot of land that the Lord personally owned, and he would have people, his people farm it for him. The nobles, believe me, did not do any work. In fact, it was considered almost a sin. And they once showed, a few years back, a picture of Charles XII out tending his flower garden. And he was down on his hands and knees with some tools in his hand, actually turning to dirt. And they said this is something his ancestors would never have done, which is basically true. They did not do any of that kind of work, but they had people to do it for them. I don't want to say they hired people, even though you might call it hired, because the people they hired were paid in food and land. All right.